Hey there, I'm Philip Molina, and welcome to our first breakdown of Game of Thrones Season 6, Episode 1, The Red Woman. For those of you new to the breakdowns that we do on this channel, I'm Fimo. Each week I will walk us through some in-depth analysis of the episode. I'll do some general Game of Thrones theories. I'll reveal some interesting connections to the books, and I'm going to point out a few things that you might have missed on your first viewing of the episode. So sit back, get comfortable, and let's dive in where we always do with a closer look at the opening images. We open on a wall, or actually the wall, but as we know in general, a wall is a border or boundary or just a line marker between what's here and what's not here. And the character that we see in this moment, Jon Snow, he's on the other side of a wall. That's the wall that separates life from death. Also note, he is as close to that wall as you can possibly be, but it's a wall of is he dead or isn't he dead, right? Now, if you know your Shakespeare, this is he or isn't he stuff might remind you of our boy Hamlet debating which one of those is better in his famous to be or not to be speech. And Shakespeare marks the difference between life and death, just like the way our wall works here, because Hamlet talks about the state after death being the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Now, obviously on the show, that sounds a lot like the unexplored lands north of the wall from which the writers never return. Except Jon Snow, he kind of has a history of going beyond the wall and yet still somehow returning.
I've been worrying about Jon for years. He always comes back.
So, does that mean he's coming back? No, well, not in this episode at least. And that mystery about what's gonna happen to this body that is, formerly known as Jon Snow, that's what this whole episode is about. What happens to us after we die, but mostly, what about the people around the person that's died? What kind of plans did they make for our bodies and for themselves? Now, before we move on, I wanna point out one more thing about these opening season 6 images of a wall. If you've ever studied a Game of Thrones map, which, be honest, if you're watching an in-depth analysis of Game of Thrones, you've probably studied the map. You'll notice that north of the wall, there's not a lot of detail. And again, it's that undiscovered country. It's Terra Nova. For you non-Latin speakers, that means new land. But what's interesting, because the show is now ahead of the books, then the show itself is now crossing this same border without the guide of George R.R. Martin helping map out the way. So cross your fingers, because out there is the darkness. Like any good red priest knows, the night is dark and full of terrors. So hopefully the showrunners can light our way. Oh, side note, Terra Nova was the name of an early 1900s British expedition to explore a new land that later became known as Antarctica. And not only is that another cold place full of ice and where winter is always coming, but that expedition party, they traveled beyond their walls to Terra Nova and they all died. None of those people came back. The undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. As we pan away from the wall, we begin hearing the howling of the wind, but really it starts to transform to the howling of Jon's direwolf, who's kind of living up to his name because it sounds almost like the spooky howls of a ghost. So here's what's great about how prominent Ghost is in this episode. There's actually a lot going on here about the relationship with direwolves. Each of the Stark children was given a direwolf and has a special connection to each one. In the books, you actually come to realize that it's not just Bran that sees through the eyes of his wolf. All of the Stark children frequently think they're dreaming, but they're actually seeing through the eyes of their wolves. They've got this very strong link to them. And I don't know if you remember, but that's why when people would talk about Robb in battle, they would say that he and his wolf, Grey Wind, they were perfectly in sync together. And I mentioned that relationship because something easy to miss here is that they shared a moment really parallel to this one. As the Red Wedding was happening, it was Grey Wind outside the twins pounding on a door, knowing that it was his spirit human that had been betrayed. Same thing's happening here. The other thing to point out about the direwolves and the Starks is that their names have slowly become more meaningful with regard to the fate of the Stark children. Rickon himself never got to go through the education and preparation for lordship that his siblings did, and so he's out there somewhere being raised by a wildling woman, and thus, instead of a proud, noble wolf, he's become more like a shaggy dog. Aria always dreamt of being a warrior, and her wolf is named after the warrior queen, Nymeria. If you remember, that wolf was set free to go be its wild self, just like Aria has left her family and embraced her own wildness. We already talked about Robb and Grey Wind, but it is worth noting that not only were they described as being as relentless and swift as the wind while in battle, but your wind, it refers to the words that you speak or the oaths that you make. And it was because Robb made what's supposed to be a pretty black and white oath into a murky gray wind that he came upon his demise. Now, Bran has Summer, which visually connects us best with the image of the life-filled warm heart tree at the top of the hill that he's currently under, but also summer is the best bet to repel the winter and the cold magic that's coming with that. Sansa had Lady, which like Aria and Nymeria was just a dream of what Sansa always wanted to be, but remember, Lady died very early on, and when Sansa let go of her childish dreams of being a dainty lady, she actually began to finally come into her own. Obviously we're gonna get back to Sansa later, but that leaves us with Jon Snow and Ghosts. So did you get ahead of me here? Ghosts are what remain after death, but more notable, they're literally people that somehow stay around after they die. If the wolves predicted the fate of the Starks, Jon is destined to be a sort of ghost by still inhabiting this world after his death. We'll just have to wait and see when that freaking happens. Okay, now our next missable moment. Did you catch how long Davos stares at the blood left in the snow after Jon's body was moved? I definitely see what looks like a wolf on the left there, and I definitely cannot see what a lot of people think is a dragon on the right. Like where? I do not see it, but I understand why people want to believe there's a dragon there, and maybe there is, even though I don't see it. But as we go into this series that some of you might know, I'll say that this could end up being a big spoiler, so skip ahead to this time if you don't want to know. But a lot of people think that Jon Snow, who Ned Stark claims is his bastard son, is actually the son of Ned's dead sister, Lyanna. And if you remember, she was supposedly kidnapped and raped by Rhaegar Targaryen, who was the Mad King's son and Dany and Viserys' older brother. Except some people think that Rhaegar and Lyanna were actually engaged in a forbidden love affair, since Rhaegar was married to Ellaria, the one that the Mountain raped and murdered, and Lyanna was supposed to marry Robert Baratheon. This alleged rape and kidnapping is why Robert started his rebellion that led to him becoming king. But anyway, the theory is that when Ned was rescuing Lyanna, he found her already dying, supposedly from the abuse from Rhaegar, but probably from just childbirth, and that there was this little baby Jon there, and that Ned promised Lyanna to not tell people that he was the son of a Stark and a Targaryen. So Ned, like Littlefinger did with Sansa, pretends that he has this bastard child out of wedlock, which would be very out of character for this noble Ned Stark, and that's why people are hoping to see a wolf and a dragon there, because that would probably confirm his mother and father. Up next we see Melisandre, who you might be thinking, hey, that's the Red Woman, that's who this episode is named after, but I'd actually say, hey, stop shouting at your screen. But also, I think the title of this episode isn't really just about her. In fact, I'll come back to it, but I think it's mostly about the Red Women. You'll see what I mean as we move forward. But back to this moment for a second, I just want to point out one easy to miss detail. Note how much more bundled up Melisandre is here than recently when she was bragging to Jon Snow.
You're not cold, my lady.
Never. The Lord's fire lives within me, Jon Snow. Feel.
It looks like she's not feeling that same internal heat at this moment. That would make a lot of sense as to why she's feeling so low already. And then, did you catch what she said? She looks at Jon's body and she says,
I saw him in flames, fighting at Winterfell.
obviously she feels so down because that never ended up happening. Her flames were wrong. Except, I'm gonna put out that maybe she's not wrong. It just might not have happened yet. If you remember right now, the Boltons hold Winterfell, and just like they said this episode, a lot of people are gonna wanna take it from them. Who better than a newly resurrected Jon Snow to take back his home? Actually, if you like that theory, I'm gonna give you a bonus one here. There are a lot of rumors that Robb Stark left a will, which makes sense as he was King of the North, and as king and as the head of a household, House Stark, he very easily could have left it in that will that upon his death, Jon Snow was to be legitimized as Jon Stark and become the rightful heir and Lord of Winterfell. So it would actually become his duty to do what Melisandre saw in the flames and go fight to win back Winterfell. Then we stop in with Sir Alliser Thorne, and he gives a pretty effective speech actually to his men.
Loyalty is the foundation on which the Night's Watch is built.
And it's only worth noting that when Julius Caesar was betrayed, his assassins used that exact same logic. He was gonna use his power to inadvertently destroy Rome, just like Thorne is saying Snow would have done to the Watch.
Jon Snow was going to destroy the Night's Watch.
After that, we're actually taken to Winterfell to see Ramsay pay his respects to his ex Miranda, and this shot is actually a direct match for the shot of Jon Snow's face, showing that in death, we are all the same. The corpses are no different, but the plans made by those around the corpse, that's where you find the differences. And again, that's basically what this episode is about, the aftermath of death. So it's really Ramsay who we learn more about, who even when he seems to have a heart for a second and he pains for her, what is his plan for the body?
This is good meat. Feed it to the hounds.
He wants to feed her to the dogs. Man, I would love to see the resurrected Jon Stark riding into Winterfell and then giving Ramsay some of his own medicine. He has this fondness of sending hounds after people, so you gotta love that image of him being eaten alive by ghosts. Like, maybe he would end up looking like his House Sigil. Here's hoping. Speaking of House Bolton, just a quick explanation about Roos's statement about his new wife's baby. He's just reminding him that if Ramsay's a failure and his new baby is a boy, then he'll make the baby the heir to the Bolton name instead of Ramsay. That's all. Moving on, we see Sansa and Reek/Theon's escape, and they actually touch on her theme when Sansa doesn't want to cross the water because she thinks it'll kill her, and Theon lets her know that, sure, yeah, death is equal to death, but what dogs do to a body rather than the cold, that's a much uglier way to go. And that also leads to this really sweet moment where Theon holds Sansa to help warm her, but it ends up kind of becoming a really messed up version of just an affectionate hug. It's fitting that they're sitting where they are because as far as these two know, they're the only children of Winterfell left, and even though they're not technically related, they're the closest thing they have to actual family. I mean, remember, that's why Theon actually gave Sansa away at her wedding to Ramsay. So this twisted, uprooted mess of a tree, it's a lot like what's become of their weirdo family tree that they now share. Okay, then we get this pretty cool fight where Brienne and Pod save the day, and Pod has clearly learned a lot about fighting from Brienne. I'm just gonna quickly point out that this Theon saving Pod is like a full circle moment for when Pod saved Tyrion. That was when Pod entered manhood, by the way, so this could be the moment that Reek is gone and Theon has returned to manhood, something that was literally taken from him. Also, this moment after the fight where Sansa exchanges the same vows that Brienne and Catelyn exchanged in season 2 was amazing.
And I vow that you shall always have a place in my home, and that I shall ask no service of you that might bring you dishonor.
It's incredibly rare on this show to see a moment that's just this hopeful. I predicted before this season that the Starks would rally, and it's really feeling like it's gonna happen. Also, this was the moment I was alluding to earlier about Sansa and her direwolf lady. Sansa had her fake version of being a lady. She wanted to marry Joffrey. She had a big crush on the Gay Knight of Flowers. Entertaining that possibility of being Littlefinger's lady was just more of this like fake illusion of what a lady is. But it's not until she dumps all of that, lets the fantasy version of a lady die with her wolf, and now not until she actually fights for her life and gets down and dirty does she finally get to preside as the head of a household. She is now the Lord of the Starks at this moment, though the proper title is what she had to walk away from before. She is now Lady Stark. It's extra touching to remember that in this moment that feels a lot like a wedding actually. Pod's like the priest or something. She's got some connection to her father being here as a witness. Brienne's sword is Oathkeeper, which was made from the Valyrian steel that was provided when Tywin had Ned Stark's sword ice melted down. He's right there in that little sword. And oh man, if you were not crying tears of joy after that moment, by the way, how about some tears of sorrow when you watch Cersei go from running blissfully to the harbor to the opposite drama mask of just straight up tragedy. Her face, she's just so resigned to having a terrible life now. These shots indicate how alone she feels in this moment, especially when you realize they're purposely being mirrored to when Myrcella left back in season 2. But now she's just so alone. And after that walk that ended last season, I cannot imagine Cersei being any more broken. Like, this is rock bottom, except as she goes into the prophecy, which opened last season, by the way, you're reminded that witch foretold that all of her children would die. So she still might lose Tommen. And if that happens, I think she is literally she's gonna go crazy, like just straight up crazy. Her story about her mother's dead body and then wondering about Myrcella's is yet another example of the aftermath after the death of loved ones.
As her skin turned black, and her lips peeled back from her teeth,
Her reaction tells us that Cersei sees death as corruption. It destroys all that was good. Her golden mother and golden children are gonna be ruined and bloated and decayed. She sees death as a punishment, which makes sense when you hear that she sees herself as a monster who does terrible things. She's not wrong either. Moving on, Jaime makes us super pumped for a vengeance storyline, and weirdly, something about this scene makes us kind of root for this very unusual, once very hateable couple. And then we're on to Septa Unella shaming yet another queen, and as she reads from the seven-pointed star, the Bible of the Faith of the Seven, and she makes Marjorie flinch, it's all reminiscent of the times in history where religious frenzy took over, like the Spanish Inquisition when Catholics in Spain tortured people for not being Catholic enough, and the Puritans in Massachusetts with their Salem witch trials, and unfortunately also in just parts of the world today. Also, after Marjorie admits that she's a sinner, the High Sparrow tells her
Have many miles to go.
possibly foreshadowing a walk of shame for her too. Okay, then we go to Dorne and everything goes to hell. We see a bloody power grab, but it mirrors the betrayal of a leader trying to make the wise choice rather than the popular one. Last episode, it was at the northernmost point of Westeros, and now it's down at the far south. So from top to bottom, Westeros is not really a place that values wisdom very much. By the way, if you're wondering what kind of letter Jaime might have sent Prince Doran to announce the murder of his only daughter, it's a surprisingly chill one. You can read it for yourself here. Now, to be fair, he does very casually ask for Ellaria's head, and I gotta admit, I'm a little frustrated by Ellaria here because her plan to avenge Oberyn for a death from a battle he agreed to take part in, it requires her slaughtering his whole family. Once again, we are seeing how the death of a person is reacted to differently by those left behind, but I feel like her reaction is just wrong. Oberyn even once said that
We don't hurt little girls in Dorne.
and that's exactly what Ellaria recently did. She hurt a little girl. Trystanne is also super young and pretty innocent, and Oberyn's nephew, by the way, and just boom, dead. We didn't know much about him other than he's a bit of a Romeo to Marcella's Juliet, but did you notice that his reaction to being the one left behind by a death was painting the stones that were gonna be placed on Marcella's eyes for the funeral? That means that he's caught up in the almost romantic elements of the funeral and that big ceremony that's really more something for the people left behind than it is for the person who died, because the dead person doesn't really know how big their party is, you know what I mean? So just one other reaction to a death. I will give Ellaria that his interest in that side of it does kind of represent her frustration with these Martell men who react to death in a pretty passive way. They're not like Oberyn was, and how she is so much more, actually. Just kind of crazy. Oh, also, for those of you wondering, like at Hephaestus451 who tweeted at me, where the heck was Trystanne when the Sand Snakes caught up to him? That isn't taking place in Dorne. That's on that boat that's just off of the coast of King's Landing. Remember we saw Jaime and Marcella have their one sweet moment before it was all ruined for them? That's a pretty unlucky boat, by the way. But now, as for how they got onto that boat, well, we know they didn't stow away because they were still on the dock when the boat pulled away. So I'm guessing they're just sneaky little snakes who followed the boat and then just somehow stayed hidden the whole time and totally dry. I don't know. So what's gonna happen to Dorne? Well, actually we don't know. Here's something interesting though. The Martells are the ruling house of Dorne, represented by the Sunspear Sigil, which is also the name of their castle, and Prince Doran was just killed, which would pass his lordship to Trystanne, but he's dead. So it would then pass to Elia and her children, but they were all killed by the mountain. Then it would pass to Oberyn, but he was also killed by the mountain. He, however, had no legitimate heirs, so it would go to his eldest illegitimate heir, Obara Sand. So does that make Obara head of House Martell? Sure, but does she rule as Lady of Sunspear? Maybe not. Remember, this is a coup, and in those, whoever the military supports is who really has the power. In this moment, it really seems like they might be in support of Ellaria, so we'll see. I think it would be cool actually if there was some debate or even a battle between them for the final power here, but either way, what Ellaria said is right.
And weak men will never rule Dorne again.
Gonna be a lady. Also worth noting, their house sigil kind of predicted part of this because it depicts the son being pierced by a spear, exactly what happened to the prince's son, also pierced by a spear. And in the books, a really big deal is made about how in Dorne, the seat of power, it actually does pass to women as well as men. So while there, Marcella was actually considered the rightful queen of Westeros because she's older than Tommen. After Joffrey's death, it would have gone to her. But honestly, the Dorne storyline is epically different different in the books. Like, in fact, you might even like it better there. Here's a quick tease that I'll give you. In the books, Dorne is preparing to take on the Lannisters by forging a really important union with somebody else who has a lot of power and a bone to pick with the people of King's Landing. Daenerys. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on in the books there. By the way, all these differences, that's a really great reason to read the books, especially because the story is pretty different in some very cool ways. For instance, Marjorie in the books is not a prisoner for lying, it's for a much spicier reason, but also because you get this way deeper understanding of it all. Like the fact that all Starks might be wargs, or the prophecies in the books, they're way more detailed. And if you don't have any time to read the books, do like I did and get the audiobooks from audible.com. Actually, when I got really impatient, by the way, I would listen to them on 2x speed because the app lets you do that and my brain just adjusted to it. So I flew through them, like seriously, like I plowed through all the books in just a couple of weeks by just listening to the audiobooks whenever I had any downtime. And the guy who reads the books, like who narrates them, he's really good at doing the voices. And since the story is a bit different there, it all feels kind of like bonus episodes of the TV show. Like for instance, the Lady Stoneheart character, she's not even in the show, but she's like epic in a way in the books, and I'm not gonna spoil anything about who she is, but I will say, holy crap, it's one of the craziest things that you could imagine happening in the story, and it actually plays into the themes of this episode about what happens after death. And I wish I could tell you more, but the spoilers are too big. Just go listen to the books. I sent Audible a letter to tell them how much I love the books, and they hooked us up with a link to give anyone from our audience a free 30-day trial and a free book credit. So if you go to audible.com/newrockstars, you can sign up and download the first book, which is called Game of Thrones, for free. You also get another free book every month after that, so you can easily get the whole series. Okay, then let's travel across the Narrow Sea to catch up with Tyrion and Varys, and I'm not gonna point out too much here because I think it was pretty straightforward, but I am gonna mention that this scene of Tyrion descending to where the people actually are is something he picked up when serving in King's Landing, and something that we rarely see Daenerys do with all her scenes taking place in the pyramid. This means he really could teach her a lot still, and they could have a very powerful alliance. I will also mention that as Varys and Tyrion wonder about who the Harpy could be that's planning all of these attacks, and possibly maybe also the same person that is their resident Banksy spray painting graffiti in English on the walls, those shots make us feel like the two of them are being watched. I actually like that they're building up this mystery because I hope it's gonna pay off with a big reveal. Here's a theory though, could the Harpy be Varys? He did show up right as that stuff started to happen, but we will get to that maybe in the comments. Moving on, the ships burn, and you know that there's another family out there who's really badass and has so many boats. Could this be the way to bring them into Daenerys' story? If so, that means this year could be about the alliances that Daenerys is gonna need to forge if she's ever gonna march on Westeros. And considering that there are now only like 10 to 15 episodes left after this season, she's gotta get a move on. Like you can tell that Jorah feels this deadline approaching too, since he wants to see what happens before his scale takes over. And I'm gonna come back to something Dario says to Jorah in a little bit, but in the meantime, let's plow forward. We see Dany captive with the Dothraki, and I like how she looks to the skies while they're telling their super like bro-y jokes. Like she's wishing Drogon would just show up and just like fry the hell out of these guys. But what else is interesting is how far Dany's status has fallen in the Dothraki world at this moment. She was the Khaleesi not long ago, and it was Viserys who was made to walk alongside them as the pitiful captive.
You walk.
Now it's her. Then Dany meets this new called Moro, and in the books, he's actually a blood rider of Drogo's, and so it seems like maybe he absorbed most of Drogo's power. It's actually not clear if they have that connection here, but he's definitely absorbed a lot of douchiness from somewhere. This debate about how great it is to see a naked woman, it gets a little meta when you realize that that's actually why some people watch this show and probably what they debate about the best 5 things about Game of Thrones. Those people are probably very surprised by the end of the episode, but we will get to that. Something I think is interesting here is that the customs of the Dothraki are both what saved Daenerys from Khal Drogo here, but also what damns her a moment later to be sent away to Vaes Dothrak. Oh, also, Daenerys here repeats her phrase about never giving birth again until the sun rises in the west and sets in the east.
When the sun rises in the west,
I will walk
and then that sets in the east.
Now, some people think of that phrase as less of a never statement and more of a prophecy. I used to think that it could be about Dorne maybe with their sun sigil, but with what happened earlier, now I'm starting to wonder, what if it's another play on the word sun? And we're talking about the child of someone who gains power or maybe is raised in the west but comes to settle in the east. If so, who could that be about? Because there are only so many prominent sons going around these days. Jorah and Tyrion are both prominent sons that grew up in the west and have now come to the east. But also, Jon is a pretty prominent son who may not have gone to the east now, but it doesn't mean he never will. Let me know what you think about that in the comments. Let's keep going. Actually, just a few things to point out before we wrap up the episode. We see Aria, though she doesn't see us or anything at all. And if you watch that scene again, you might notice that during that beating, all the visual edits are hitting you at the exact same moment that the sounds of the beating are. It's meant to disorient us and confuse us just as much as she's disoriented, though I think it's hitting her a lot harder than it hits us. The other thing here is that she's learning a lot through this punishment of blindness. And if you listen really closely, you hear that the crime she committed actually did some good. That murder of Meryn Trent is what these men are talking about as to why they no longer will ever visit the house of prostitution that specializes in children for pedophiles.
What happened to that king's gun?
But harder to hear, there's a woman that says, which is one of the main mantras of the House of Black and White, considering usually that price that you pay.
Only death can pay for life.
Then Aria just being made blind is actually a pretty good deal for her. Plus, it's obviously just setting up her getting some Daredevil-like powers, or at least that's what that badass warrior titan in the background is foreshadowing, what this training is gonna turn her into. This is essentially gonna be part 2 of Sirio's lessons, and I'm just getting pretty excited for badass assassin Aria, finally. Then we're back where we started at the wall, where Davos is being asked to surrender by Thorne, and there's this really great but easily missable moment here with Davos. He asks Thorne for
some mutton.
Like, sure, it's kind of a hilariously random request, but notice that after Thorne says, sure, we'll give you mutton,
We'll give you food.
Davos sighs, disappointed, and then he tells his men a moment later that they would have been killed if they'd opened that door.
In my learned opinion, we open that door
and they'll slaughter us all.
That's because Davos just tested Thorne. Had Thorne said no, or even shown some amount of resistance to this really weird request for mutton, then his intentions would have been true. That's accurate to how he would behave if he were telling the truth. But being so quickly agreeable and giving him just a simple, quick, yeah, sure, that tells Davos that he's only trying to say what it takes to get that door open, and is probably not gonna make good on any of these promises. And then we're into the closing images, and it's the big reveal of the episode. We see Melisandre take off her dress, and just like Stanley Kubrick messed with our expectations about the erotic peep show that Jack Nicholson thought he was gonna get in The Shining, the show makes us think that we're gonna get yet another empty nude scene from the Red Woman, and then it twist reveals her true form, that of a very, very old woman, with some theories placing her anywhere between 100 and 400 years old. This is the moment that I was like, those guys that watch the show for naked ladies probably didn't love this moment. But this is also very reminiscent of the transformation of Disney's Evil Queen, which is also a bit of a witch who works with spells and potions and also transforms to an evil old woman, and she also examines herself in the mirror. But I would say Melisandre isn't that. She's actually never been further from being the villain than in this moment. She's literally exposed as this fragile creature who's completely lost. Her cold, white, wrinkly body, it mirrors the sun revealing the cold, white, wrinkly wall in the opening images, and right now, so much about her becomes clear, finally. Earlier, Daario tells Jorah that he wishes he can grow old.
If you grow old.
If I grow old. I hope I do. I want to see what the world looks like when she's done conquering it.
He wants to see what happens with the Daenerys story. We all do, by the way, buddy. But he means it's not a luxury that people tend to have in that world. You don't grow old, you die pretty young. So if she's actually hundreds of years old, then she's seen many winters and many wars. When you're that used to winter and war, then the one that you're currently living in at this moment, it doesn't seem so momentous. She sees the long view, which is why she always feels so detached from everything. Everyone she's ever known has died at some point, So what does it matter if she burns some people at the stake or if she sends people to be slaughtered in battle? They're all gonna go sometime. She is thinking of the longer play. However, now the things that she saw in the flames that she had been attributing all her actions to, all that stuff is not coming true. Everything she's done cannot be justified anymore. And that realization, it overwhelmingly saddens her. But also, that means she's headed into a future that is completely uncertain. And that's uncharted territory, Terra Nova. And that terrifies her. She climbs into bed just like a child hiding from something bad they've done, or maybe hiding from the monsters that she thinks might be out there in the darkness. Note that she stays near the fire and bundles up under the covers because the light in her is almost completely out. She's lost all the warmth, and with that, all of the red. And now she's just left with the wintry cold and almost the appearance of a White Walker to match. But before you see all that as like a sad downer, let's remember what else happened this episode. Remember how I kept saying that this episode's about what people do after a death, what happens to the people left behind? So this episode showed us that by really focusing on widows. A widow, by definition, is completely defined by being the person left behind after the death of a loved one. So while the Red Woman ends the episode not being red at all, her Red Woman qualities are being redistributed to all of the show's widows out there. And I'll tell you what I mean by red qualities. Red represents lots of things in literature: sex, passion, danger, blood, fire, death. The Red Woman herself represents ultimate intensity in your passionate, zealot-like faith. And that's all being sent out to different widows here. Septonella enjoys drawing blood from Marjorie, who is twice a widow and has been defined by the men that she's been married to. And here, when she finally admits to her sins, she becomes faithful to her religion, like the Red Woman. The Sand Snakes obviously leave a lot of red in their wake, but their leader, Ellaria, also a widow, is responsible for most of it being spilt. Her speech to Doran about his wimpiness shows her giving into not logic, but the red passion that is eager for war. And also it's a reminder of just how passionate her relationship was with Oberyn. She's letting that consume her now. Inversely, Daenerys is Khal Drogo's widow, but since she already had all of this power of being a queen, now she's having that choice of how to mourn for a person left behind taken away from her. Similarly, Cersei, another widow who was in a high state of power, is stripped of another child, who herself, by the way, she left this world with red blood pouring down her face, and she took with it Cersei's red passion and red fire as well. However, Cersei still gains a Red Woman trait in that she now is obsessed with the fulfillment of prophecies, while Melisandre has lost faith in them. By the way, yes, Melisandre herself is also a widow, if you remember that her main partner Stannis has died, and her potential new squeeze is also cold dead too. Finally, Sansa, who is technically married to multiple men and has let each of those marriages die. Fingers crossed that we'll actually see one of those exes dead soon, Ramsay. She has the red hair, sure, but she, as of this episode, has the Red Woman status, her power. More than red, she's now a woman in her own right, finally. She even quasi-marries again, but finally by her own choosing when she accepts the services of Brienne. She chooses the possibility of death rather than remaining a victim. And as the Lady of Winterfell now, she's in a position to potentially end the war in the north. She's rising as Melisandre is falling. So just like the Red Wedding flipped our expectations of what a wedding is supposed to be, that bizarro event leads us to almost bizarro marriages and bizarro red widows who subvert what people would expect of widows to be like after they're left behind by the supposedly more powerful men. These red widows aren't gonna do what you'd expect. They're not gonna rot alongside the corpse or burn themselves on the funeral pyre. They're gonna step up and be unburnt. So even though it's ironic that the least red woman in this episode is the one we know as the Red Woman, it makes a lot of sense actually. Because if the Lord of Light shines his red power where he pleases, he's momentarily shifted it away from her, but to these other women. But also, everyone clamoring for Melisandre to use his light god magic to resurrect Jon Snow in this episode, and they're disappointed that she didn't. You gotta realize that the rest of the women in this episode have been very heavily influenced by him instead. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that all of our widows are now being reborn as these powerful beings. It's like, despite what all of us had planned, that light god, we knew this this about him. He does what he wants. And in this situation, he chose to resurrect all of them instead. So all of these women on this show, they're all the ones that are getting resurrected by the Light God right now at least, and they've become the Red Woman. Okay, but the questions I'm left with. One, is Melisandre being without her faith a good thing or a bad thing for Jon Snow? Does it mean that he's got to find another way to be resurrected? Or is it like how Thoros had lost all of his faith right before he resurrected Beric Dondarrion? Is it almost a requirement maybe? Two, what do you think of the possibility of Varys being the Harpy? Let's talk about that in the comments. Three, a lot of you are wondering why the Red Woman was shown in a bath without her necklace, but looked young still there. Do you think that's a mistake the show made, or do you think it could be something else? For instance, could maybe her glamour spell had something to do with the bottles of the potion looking stuff that's on the table and not be about the necklace? Or maybe, and this could be kind of cool actually, maybe in that old episode, she did look old in that moment to Selyse, Stannis' wife. If you watch that scene again, she can barely look at her, but if you imagine it's because of how old she is and kind of gross in that moment, and if that's how Melisandre was able to make Selyse into such a devout believer, it would kind of make sense. What do you think? Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of the Game of Thrones season premiere. And if you like this, please share it with your friends. I would really love for these to catch on. But also for those of you that have been following us for a while, I really appreciate you all rooting for us and watching these things. And I know that the #1 request that you all have is for us to make more videos and get them out to you faster. That's why we were so pumped when Audible.com told us, hey, we love your videos. How can we help you? So if you've ever wondered how you can help us out, which I know a lot of you have tweeted that at me and thank you for asking, here's how you can do it. If you sign up for a free trial at Audible.com, there's no risk. You just get a free book to listen to. And if you've already read Game of Thrones or want to try something else, feel free. They've got like 250,000 things to listen to on there. But yeah, if you do that and we get enough signups, Audible's gonna keep sponsoring us to get more editors and overnight editors, which would make all the difference in getting these things out to you faster. So again, that is audible.com/newrockstars. Thank you so much for watching. I am so pumped for this season and breaking it down with you. Let's all take off our magical necklaces and make out. No, I'm just kidding. We'd be so gross. Bye.